I've been hearing a lot more of OM systems in the past 2 years in the wildlife photography industry, so I decided it was time to take a look into it myself. OM Systems sent me over their best camera model, the OM-1, to test out and review, and these are what I noticed work really well in this camera, as well as a few things that I wasn't very fond of that I'll mention later in the video as well. Huge thanks to OM Systems for sending me over the gear to try out for a month, and as usual, I wasn't paid by them for this review. They have no say in how it turns out, and I'm returning the gear after my loaner period. So let's start out with what absolutely amazed me about this camera. The image stabilization was by far the best I've ever used on a camera, which, to be honest, shocked me. I often try using a camera once before looking into the specifications on the camera body in detail, just so I can get kind of an initial unbiased take on the camera. And before I knew that this camera had 7 stops of in-body stabilization, I found myself kind of in disbelief of how stabilized it was when I was using it out in the field. And sure enough, I go home and check the specs to find out that it has 7 stops. But 7 stops also isn't terribly higher than other camera bodies that I've used. This puzzled me on why it felt like it was such a huge difference, but I think that it was partially due to this great spec, but also due to the nature of the lighter gear, and whatever algorithm they use to build image stabilization just being really well formatted for telephoto shooting. All of this to say, while there were definitely some things that let me down about this camera that I'll talk about later, I wanted to give this camera credit for having the very best image stabilization I have ever used. For my video recording nerds, the OM-1 looked pretty good. Their flat and OM-400 recording modes allowed for a good amount of color and dynamic range to be recovered in post, and I was satisfied with my results. They also offer 4K 60p 10-bit 420, which is a good baseline to record at. Ultimately, the video specs on this camera are well up to par and more than enough for most, even if not quite as impressive as the Z9 or the A1. The build of this OM-1 is great as well. For a micro four thirds camera, I often find them feeling a little too cheap and plasticky, or with a lack of good grip or ergonomics. The OM-1, in my opinion, holds well, however, and as Olympus rebranded to OM Systems over the recent years, I found myself liking how they build their camera bodies more and more. At 5.76 million dots, this is better than a decent amount of cameras out there that are full frame and APS-C, including the recent S5 II that I tested, or even the flagship Nikon Z9, which is pretty impressive. The button placements all make a good amount of sense to me as well, and are placed in comfortable and uncramped positions, unlike how I feel with Sony camera bodies. On a more detailed note, one function that I was very disappointed about with the OM-1 was the fact that when shooting in manual mode, the camera won't keep the settings tied together between photo manual mode and custom movie mode. So for example, let's say that I'm shooting photos in manual mode and I've adjusted my settings down from where I last left them off at maybe 1/500th of a shutter speed down to 1/200th of a shutter speed. I take the shot and now I want to switch over to movie mode to film 4K 60p video and 10-bit. When I do so, my settings revert to wherever I last left them on movie mode, and I'll have to readjust my settings all over once again to match what I just set them to in photo mode. This is a huge annoyance as someone who shoots both photo and video constantly and has to switch back and forth between them all the time. There might be good reasons for why they've done this. However, I'd appreciate the option to change this function in the menu at least, as when I was talking it over with them through an email, they said there is no current solution to this. On a side note, something that I do value a lot is brand relationship with their customers, to which I have to say OM Systems does a great job of. I've seen how they try to connect with the wildlife photography community at local events, as well as with creators such as myself online, and I've been impressed with their customer support. While it's hard to put money value to this, I think that it means a lot, and really them and Panasonic have been the 2 best camera brands that I've ever seen in my experience at building customer relations and listening to their consumers' feedback. Now let's talk about the biggest part, or maybe the smallest in this case, the micro four thirds sensor. On this micro four thirds camera, I tried to set my expectations accordingly. However, I do have to say that my expectations still wasn't set correctly because I think if we're honest, we as a wildlife photography community tend to have a difficult time with representing gear correctly. One of the biggest reasons why I talk about gear so much on this channel now within the past few months is that I've noticed the lack of quality review in our community so that you as viewers can make good informed decisions. My goal is to give you the most honest and real feedback I can on each piece of gear so that you can spend your hard-earned money wisely. So when it comes to my sensor expectations, they were let down a little bit. Going into it, I knew that this had a 20 megapixel sensor, so this is pretty self-explanatory, just as like my S5 II review 2 months ago. When you're down in those low 20s in megapixels, it's not ideal, but it's workable. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit, but I think that OM System's great lens selection does make this 20 megapixels a little bit more forgiving, and so for me, I find myself unimpressed, but also not disappointed in it. Where I was let down though was in low light and noise control quality. After coming off some amazing camera bodies that I've gotten to review recently to test just like the S5 II and even the Sony A1, the grain is very noticeably worse. Even when exposed properly, I was trying to avoid shooting at 3200 ISO if I could help it, and unless absolutely necessary, I wasn't even touching 6400 ISO. This isn't a surprise when you think about the fact that this sensor is an MFT sensor. However, it's something that's worth remembering if you're going to purchase a camera body that definitely isn't your go-to camera for low light shoots when doing wildlife. The one other thing that I can't say I was over the top impressed by was the autofocus on this camera, surprisingly. Again, after coming off of 2 of the best camera body reviews of the A1 and the S5 II, I might be holding the autofocus up to a little bit of a harsh light, but there was just too many times where it couldn't hold focus on the subject at hand. So let's backtrack a little bit before I get too many people worked up with this. Let's start with the good. The subject detection is amazing at detecting what is wildlife, and more specifically, birds on the OM-1. In most all scenarios, the subject detection would detect the animal I was shooting and show the box around the body as well as the really small box around the eye. I really liked the way that the OM-1 incorporated these graphical elements into the camera, and for me, it made me feel like it was intuitive and super advanced in its detection. This camera might actually have been the best I've ever seen for simply recognizing what is a bird and detecting its eye. But now for the slightly bad news. While the OM-1 could constantly detect the subjects, for some reason I had more difficulty than I should have had in actually locking on to the subject. When focusing, it failed much more often than I would expect it to, but what was even more frustrating to me, that was when I had it locked on, if I let go and re-push the shutter button to take another shot, the camera would often lose its focus, even if the composition was incredibly simple, and try to lock onto something else. There were times that some of you got to witness with me on my FPV journey out in nature earlier last month, where in the most simple of scenarios, this would happen. I would try different focus areas to see if this was the problem. I tried adjusting the focus sensitivity, but none of these things would fully fix the problem I was having, or even help very much if I'm honest. Now, let me clear this up. The autofocus wasn't horrible. Trust me, I've used horrible with old Panasonic models, but it really just wasn't amazing either. I guess I was just mostly disappointed in the autofocus because it's clear that this camera was able to pick up the subject and the eye. It just wasn't the best at actually landing that focus. Overall, I feel like I was able to tack around 65%, maybe 60% of my shots in wildlife photography, which is right about on par with the Panasonic S5 II, maybe slightly worse. Video wasn't quite as good, however. In video, it seemed to be more 40 to 50% accurate to me, so not quite as reliable enough to shoot video with, in my opinion, and I'd stick to a different camera model. If you're looking to shoot lots of video, I'd either rely on manual focus or work with a brand that invests a little bit more into autofocus capabilities in video, since video definitely isn't its strong suit when it comes to focus. One other thing that I'd like to mention about this camera is that paired with any of their wildlife lenses available, it's an incredibly light setup, even this big boy here. Personally, I don't care too much about how light my setup is, but to many, I know that a light setup means a lot in the difference between enjoying their day out or not. I got to test this camera out with 2 different lenses, including their biggest lens, the Olympus 125 to 400 millimeters 1.25 teleconverter, and the setup still felt like it was light. The camera body and lens combo gets a full 1000 millimeters of reach, which is insane when you think about how light this is. And even my 600 millimeter full frame setup is decently heavier than my OM-1 and Olympus lens setup. In a week from now, I'll be releasing reviews on both of the lenses that OM Systems sent over to me to test out. So if you're interested in seeing those reviews, I'd be honored if you subscribe to the channel below. And one thing that I'll say briefly about those 2 lenses here is that I was really impressed with one of them in particular. And I thought that it was one of my favorite lenses possibly I've ever gotten to use. I think that if OM Systems created a better camera body with better low light control and improved the autofocus just a little bit, like I was talking about, they would be a much more serious contender in the wildlife photography industry, as they already have two great choices of lenses. So let's evaluate the cost effectiveness of the camera body, then talk about who it's for. This camera comes in at $2,200. If you asked me at the beginning of this year, I'd say that makes sense. However, with the recent S5 II full frame camera release at $2,000 just a few months ago, it makes it so hard for me not to compare these two cameras since they are at the same price range and just say, well, get the S5 II. With that being said, I truly believe that the S5 II is an outlier in cost effectiveness, so it feels a little unfair to compare it to that. But even beyond that, the OM-1 really just disappoints me in how the low light capabilities are. And I guess for me, that combined with only a 20 megapixel sensor will keep me and most likely many other full frame users away from OM Systems, since this is the best the camera has to offer. So who is this camera for then? Well, I think you'd fall into one of two categories. Number one, this camera is for people who have already invested into one of the two expensive lenses in this brand. If you already own the 300mm f4 Pro or the 125 to 400mm 1.25 teleconverter Pro Olympus, this camera would most likely be a logical upgrade for you. In many ways, it feels like a flagship, and lots of its specifications perform up to the standard of a flagship. The only big thing holding it back, in my opinion, is the literal sensor size being so small. The second type of person that I can see this being for is the person that truly needs a lightweight setup and wants the best they can possibly get in the Micro Four Thirds format. In the MFT genre, the OM-1 is without a doubt the best camera I've ever gotten to use, and not many other cameras come very close to it in wildlife photography specifically. Overall, it's a great buy for the MFT genre, and with the two big exceptions of resolution and, more importantly, noise control, this camera is well worth its price tag. If this review helped you out, I'd be honored if you subscribe to the channel below. And if you want to check out a shootout I had with my cousin using this Micro Four Thirds gear versus a full frame gear setup, check out this video here in the end screen.